Hi, I'm Simon Bridges, CEO of the Auckland Business Chamber. Welcome back to another weekly Business Insights webinar. And this week, really pleased to have with us Sydney Straver of And Bloom. And Bloom focuses a lot on sustainability and ESG. And so we're really looking forward to some insight into that area, some tips and some thoughts. And so, Sydney, it's great to have you with us, and we really look forward to hearing from you before which or after which I'm going to ask you, because you asked me to off air, ask some really tough questions. So I'm going to have to think of those as you speak. But yeah, welcome. Really look forward to hearing from you.
Kia ora, Simon. Thank you so much. And please feel free to come with those tricky questions. And for
Mhm.
the audience as well, if there's any tricky questions that pop up, feel free to connect with us after the session. Great. So yeah, kia ora koutou. My name is Sydney Straver. I'm the founder and CEO of Bloom, based in Auckland. After more than half a decade of helping businesses and investors in Europe, I moved back to the Pacific a year and a half ago to move the needle here, really focusing on sharing those best practices I learned while working with businesses and investors in Europe, which is very much a leading market on this sustainability space, and we'll get into that today. So yeah, today's all about sharing some insights on how to embed sustainability and ESG into the business strategy. We're really keen to share some actionable takeaways for you to shift the dial from investment to impact, and hopefully walk away with some things that you can actually do to get going on this. Just a quick disclaimer that this is a webinar for educational purposes only. We don't intend to provide advice and do encourage you to consult with professionals for your specific situation. So now that we've cleared that, let's dive right in by starting with who we are. So we're a strategy consultancy firm, as Simon already alluded to, really specialised in the sustainability and ESG space, bringing global expertise to Aotearoa, New Zealand. More recently, we've also opened an office in Australia, in Sydney, and we're really on a mission to help investors and businesses surf the sustainability and ESG wave with a focus on value creation. On the right, some stats showcasing our experience. We've worked with over 10 investors, ranging from private equity, venture capital to family offices and KiwiSaver providers. We've assessed over 90 companies. And increasingly, we're doing these strategy workshops with executives to shift the dial even further and really build that capability in the boardroom to make sure sustainability thrives. Before we delve into the content, I'd love for you to take a minute to maybe reflect and maybe jot down some thoughts on the following question. So from a financial and impact perspective, what do you consider to be the most important sustainability issues for your organization today? So let's take a quick step back and understand what we're even talking about today. I can imagine for some of you, the whole term ESG might be new. So let's start with sustainability. So when we talk about sustainability, it's about environmental matters. It's about climate change. It's about how we handle our waste. It's about how we use our land, but also about the energy we secure, how we handle our nature and biodiversity, and also how we transition from a linear to a closed loop circular economy. Besides environmental matters, sustainability is also about social matters. So it's about how do we ensure product quality and safety? How do we tackle diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do we involve communities? How do we manage our talent? As I'm walking through these, you might be thinking, hey, I'm already doing a lot of these things. And that's essentially what we're trying to get to here. And especially under this governance part, that might become apparent. So when we look at sustainability from a governance perspective, it's very much about what controls are in place for supply chain control. How do we strategically embed sustainability into operations and across the value chain? How do we handle our data, ethics and compliance? So what you can see is that it's quite a long list of topics that we're talking about here. And all of these so-called environmental, social and governance matters translate into this ESG framework that I was alluding to earlier. And this ESG framework is essentially a framework to embed sustainability into the business strategy. So on the page here, you can see the three buckets of environmental, social, and governance, and then the themes that I was just discussing, which is not non-exhaustive. It's much more than just these. And businesses really use these three categories to better understand what are the impacts, risks, and opportunities for our business from a sustainability perspective. There's also heaps of frameworks out there that help businesses do this. You might have heard of the so-called ESG alphabet soup. Those are on the bottom half of the page here, a selection of those. And there's so much to go through, so we're not going to go through that today, but please be aware that there are multiple frameworks to help you build your sustainability or ESG strategy. And if you've got any questions around those, again, feel free to connect with us after this session. So what's driving ESG or sustainability? There's certain factors that really fuel that integration, regardless of all the political buzz at the moment. One is materiality, two is regulation, and three is stakeholder demand. So sustainability has a significant impact if it's not managed appropriately. And for every business, this holds true from two perspectives. One is the impact perspective, which is this top flow here, which is very much about, as an organization, what impact do we have on our stakeholders, including the planet and society? On the bottom half, there's the other flow, which is the financial perspective, which is very much about what are the impacts of the stakeholders, including the planet and society, on us as an entity, on our enterprise value. And a good example here is that in New Zealand and in Australia increasingly as well, businesses are factoring in climate-related risks and opportunities into their decision-making. That's mostly coming from the financial risks associated with climate change. And this whole concept of double materiality, which is answering kind of these two questions for your business, is really key because it really helps businesses to identify and manage their sustainability impacts, risks, and opportunities, and also narrow down sustainability for your organization. And we'll talk a little bit more towards the end of the session about that. Again, a question to reflect on that. So has your organization conducted a double materiality assessment to identify key sustainability impacts, risks, and opportunities? So besides that concept of materiality and really understanding risks and opportunities, sustainability is also increasingly regulated in jurisdictions across the globe. In New Zealand, we were quite an early adopter with the climate-related disclosure standards, which is much more for listed businesses and large financial institutions. But in 2021, we were already working on that, which is great. Europe is quite the leader in this space on sustainability. In Europe, there is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And if there's any businesses listening in that might export to the EU or have suppliers or customers in the EU, you might be getting some questions related to this regulation because it's extremely exhaustive. It requires businesses in the EU to actually engage with their value chain and gather data around these ESG factors. In Australia, recently across the Tasman, they adopted the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards, which mandates climate reporting as well for most businesses, which is also very exciting. So we'll really see this wave towards more transparency and clarity and consistency around sustainability reporting across the globe. And then finally, besides regulation, of course, sustainability is increasingly demanded by various stakeholders, and it's not just the next generation coming into the workforce, it's also investors that are typically looking for investments that align with the future-proof economy. It's governments that are introducing policies that drive sustainable practices. It's competitors in your space that might be adopting sustainability and integrating that into this decision-making and strategies. And then it's also value chain parties. So again, your suppliers and customers, wherever they are located across the globe, they might be subject to regulatory regimes around sustainability, and as a result, might be asking you questions to gather input for their compliance-related side of things. I did quickly allude to the kind of geopolitical situation at the moment. I do quickly want to touch upon that if we go back to the core of what doing good business looks like, it's understanding impacts, risks, and opportunities, and no short-term policy shifts, whether that's Trump coming into office or whether that's other things happening at the moment. No short-term policy shifts is going to change the fact that it's important to understand your risks and opportunities and factor that into your decision-making. And the good and bad news is that sustainability is in part of that risk and opportunity assessment as well. So I always like to pause and reflect on this quote from Simon Mundy, who's a Financial Times reporter, who said the following, especially with the whole geopolitical situation going on at the moment. What's important is that serious work is done to really grapple with the challenges and the opportunities that we face. And those who do it right will be surfing the wave of the single biggest economic transformation and one of the biggest opportunities in the whole history of human civilization. So how do we make sure working on ESG is not a cost driver or a compliance exercise, but rather an impactful and more strategic one? After working with quite some businesses and investors, we found that there's actually a hierarchy towards that integration of ESG needs. And effectively, it's these three building blocks. The first one is fact, which is very much about setting the foundations within your organization to comply with regulations and standards. That's really more that tick the box exercise. And at this stage, value creation is low because you're just kind of being reactive and compliant to what you need to do. The second stage is extract. This is very much around assessing and reporting on ESG, showcasing progress on goals and ambitions. And at this stage, you really start to think about sustainability and ESG more strategically and really factor that into your business plans. It's also where value creation typically starts to kick in. When we work with clients, we see that they've got year on year reporting, and that as a result of that, they're kind of unlocking low-hanging fruit, which translates into value creation. The final level is impact, which is where businesses start to really surf the green wave more strategically, where they focus on one or multiple strategic priorities from a sustainability perspective. For example, we're seeing increasingly carbon reduction strategies, which if you do that well can really translate into value creation. So that might sound a little theoretical, but what does that look like in terms of deliverables for you as a business? Under fact, it's having an ESG policy, which essentially is just more of a governance document. It sets out how you look at sustainability, what it means to your organization, how you integrate it, how often you report. The other thing is obviously regulatory compliance. That's part of doing business, so I shouldn't really explain that. And then obviously building the capabilities internally. So really training the team to make them aware of what we're even talking about, which is often forgotten in this case. Under extract, it's doing due diligence. So really understanding what's happening in your value chain around ESG, talking to your suppliers, talking to your customers, having those discussions. Then it's also about reporting on ESG at least annually. And then finally, if you have investors that are asking ESG related topics, it's also good to report to them on this. Even if they're not asking about it, just show them the work you're doing on this. And if they are asking about it, great, ask their help. How can they, what learnings do they have from working with other portfolio companies, and what learnings can you take from that? And under impact, again, it's much more strategic. So here we're really talking about more in-depth strategic roadmap, impact deep dives, again, related to carbon, for example, or really zooming into diversity, equity, and inclusion. And also it's in-depth competitor benchmarking. So really understanding what your competitors are doing more in-depth on this front. It takes a while to get there because the foundations, the other two building blocks, are really key to make sure that value creation actually gets unlocked. And the reason that is because you also need to build that capability internally to have these discussions. So again, a question to reflect on all of this. Where does your organization currently sit within that hierarchy of ESG needs? And what is your desired future state? So it's important to think about this because applying that hierarchy can actually lead to value creation. And I've used that word a lot. So let's look at what that actually looks like. That value creation typically comes in three forms when working on sustainability. So one is cost reduction through resource efficiency, for example, reduced cost of capital, gaining access to sustainable funding options or sustainability linked loans, if you will. But also under cost reduction, really that employee productivity. And I alluded to the next generation coming into the workforce, and there's some really good statistics out there that support that there's an increasing need to work in an organization that aligns with values. So the research is quite strong for that. The other component is risk reduction. So we see if you work on sustainability, you get reduced regulatory risk, reduced supply chain risks, and reduced governance risks. And under business growth, again, some examples, once you start working on this, you start unlocking new revenue streams, you start diversifying a little bit more, tackling into those trends and developments on this front. You might be able to charge price premiums. There's, again, good science out there that the willingness to pay for sustainable products is there. Probably might see that in the supermarkets if you're a sustainable consumer yourself. And then finally, obviously that competitive differentiation, right? So really being a first mover on this. And there's quite some potential to do that, especially here in the New Zealand market, because we're quite behind compared to Europe. So we spoke earlier about that concept of double materiality, and I'd just like to zoom into that a little bit more because that's effectively the cornerstone of your sustainability strategy. So just a quick recap, the concept of double materiality is about considering financial and impact topics and really understanding from those two lenses, what are the most relevant topics for us as an organisation. So what that typically looks like, on the left here, you've kind of got that long list again that we started the session off with. Then you consider those two flows, and then you map that out on a double materiality matrix. And essentially you get 5 to 6 themes that are the cornerstone of your strategy. So for example, here we can see a tech company from an environmental perspective, they consider energy and climate to be material. From a social perspective, talent attraction, service quality, and product impact. And then under governance, they're looking at data privacy. And effectively, these 5 themes that this organisation in this case has identified are the basis for their disclosures around ESG, but also the basis for their strategic discussions within the boardroom on this. So again, it's really a framework to facilitate those discussions, drive the reporting, but also drive the broader strategy. So once we've got those 5 to 6 themes laid out, we need to leverage those outcomes to convert that investment into impact, which we started the session with. And there's a kind of a 5-step strategic lens to help you facilitate those discussions. The first step is looking at ESG across the value chain. So really nothing much more than looking at what are the trends and developments in our operations, what are the trends and operations we see under suppliers, the trends and developments under customers. Then the second phase is understanding the maturity of competitors. So what are peers doing on this front? What can we learn from them? And where are we compared to them, and where do we want to be? The third step is that materiality assessment. Most likely you've done this before going into this 5-step approach, but it's always good to revisit that annually. And especially now with the turbulent economic conditions, things are changing, so your risks and opportunities might shift as well. And that needs to be considered in this materiality assessment. The 4th step is looking at your company performance. So again, based on those 5 to 6 themes you've identified in your materiality assessment, you disclose your performance. So you write how you manage that theme. For example, data privacy might be a material topic for you. You write about how you handle that theme internally, how you manage it, what policies are in place, what practices are in place. And then you also link some KPIs to that. And then once you've got your performance written out, and that's effectively your sustainability report, you can bridge the gap between where you are and where you want to be and what the market's doing, and translate that into strategic priority projects, which is the final step. From experience, we've seen that this 5-step approach is really extremely useful, especially within the boardrooms, to facilitate those discussions, and also share these across departments. So for example, if talent management is a material topic for your business, it might make sense to have use this 5-step framework as a discussion starter with the HR department. And with the data privacy being a theme, you can go to your chief data officer and really have those discussions. So it's really about thinking, who's internally responsible and linking that to your ESG work to really make it thrive and part of the DNA. So I'm going to be a little bit cheeky here. We're of course advisors, but we've also launched a 10-week program, which is really focused on helping build these capabilities in your teams, which is relevant for all businesses at any stage, whether you're an early stage startup, well established, or if you're an investor, it doesn't really matter. There's 2 key outcomes of this 10-week program. One is that capabilities for a self-sustaining ESG management approach, and 2 is a robust ESG strategy to really position you for long-term success. 10 weeks sounds quite long, but it's actually just 5 one-hour live sessions spread across 10 weeks. So in total, 5 hours of time commitment. So that was a lot of information. Love to just translate that into 3 actionable takeaways for you. So ESG provides a framework to measure and progress on sustainability. It's nothing more or less than that. It's just a framework to help you structure this whole sustainability thing for your organization. To turn investment into impact, we need to understand those building blocks, right? So we need to understand how you govern sustainability, which is that fact level, how you report on it, which is that extract level, and then impact is really driving strategies around that. And using double materiality stewards on ESG strategically embeds sustainability into the business strategy. So if you're listening now and you don't have a double materiality assessment done yet, that's probably going to be your first step because that's the cornerstone of your sustainability strategy. Yeah, and thanks so much for joining today. Feel free to join us on the stream in May it starts, so there's plenty of time for you to get started. And in the meantime, feel free to check out our LinkedIn and website. We've got quite some free resources on there to get you going on this front as well.
Fantastic. Hey, thanks so much, Sydney. Look, that's a really interesting, I think useful, both strategic framework you've got there for sustainability in that 10-week program. Look, I've got a handful of random questions. I think, one, I don't know if they're difficult or not, but what's your story that you were in Europe and doing this and you've come back and you're doing this? I mean, in brief terms.
Yeah, so I'm actually half Dutch, so my roots are in New Zealand and in the Netherlands. My work there was very much working doing exactly this. So as working for an asset management consultancy, specifically in the ESG team, and then helping businesses and investors as well.
Brilliant. And we think about Europe. I mean, you made the point, and I'm absolutely sure you're right about Europe being out the front as a leader in this area. Of course, what's also true is we're seeing under President Trump, in the US, they're really walking back from all of this, and we can all have our different views on these things, but what do you sort of assess? Is in New Zealand, I think, is it still the case that we in the end we're more at the European end, or we're seeking to be, and so it's still very important for businesses to be, as you say, measuring, plotting, thinking about their ESG and DEI requirements.
Yeah, so there is indeed a lot happening in the US on this front. In Europe as well, there has been some pushback on the regulation, reducing the scope of that. But as mentioned in the session, I think if we go back to the core of doing good business, it's understanding your risks and
Mm,
opportunities. And I think the framework of ESG in itself and that concept of materiality, where you really kind of map out the ones that are most relevant to your organization. I think doing that exercise actually is always a wake-up call for many businesses, and especially in the boardroom again, where board members will see themes that they're actually working on, and they're actually just formalizing the structures around that. Um, and I think, yeah, no policy or regulation is going to change the fact that that remains part of doing good business, really factoring in those risks and
mm.
opportunities to secure your license to operate and grow, really.
And funnily enough, that was going to be my sort of next question, which is, I think, I don't know about all, but most business people and businesses want to do the right thing, right? And in a, if you want to call it moral sense, or by the community and their country and then ultimately the planet. But of course, it's also the right thing for business. I think, you probably really answered this in your presentation, but in terms of efficiency, risk reduction, and business growth,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, no, I think that's right. And then the other thing I think that's important to cover is a lot of people can think, well, maybe not a lot, but some people might think, hey, that's great. If I'm a big corporate, I should be thinking about that. But look, I'm just an SME. Maybe I've got 20 staff or 40 staff or maybe 5 staff. Um, and so, this is not for me. What's your answer and your thought on that?
Yeah, that's a discussion we often have. And to be frank, I think the whole ESG framework is quite flexible in its sense that it's actually size agnostic and it works for large corporates and it works for large investors and it works for small businesses. And it doesn't really matter at which stage of your growth journey you are, whether you're SME or not, because at the end of the day, we all have staff that needs, for example, if you're a manufacturing company, you need to secure your health and safety. it's part of your license to operate, really. So it's things like those, and actually, again, building a framework around that, which isn't really size dependent. It's much more related to the sense of doing good business, really.
Yeah. And proportionate. I mean, it's to your business size. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the other one, I mean, it's we're probably again, at some levels covered this, but you see it and maybe just flesh it out for us. This shouldn't just be about cost and compliance. It's meant to be more impactful and value additive, I suppose, than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen, a lot of organizations where it still is a compliance or cost exercise. So you'll see, an organization have one person that's responsible for sustainability and they're doing all the work on this. And we've seen in those cases, and the numbers show that it does become a cost driver, and that's arguably where some of that political buzz around this might have come from. Because if one person's just doing it and it's not part of this company strategy, not part of the business plan, what are we really doing? Who are we kidding? So it's really about, again, and that's why we're so keen on building those capability internally to really make sure everyone feels ownership of this. And it's really not about fluffy environmental or social stuff. It's really going back to the core again of doing good business. And I feel like I'm repeating that a lot, but it is effectively what it is about, understanding risk, understanding opportunities, and factoring that into your decision making.
Brilliant. Hey, well, look, Sydney, we really appreciate having you and Bloom and what you're doing in this area. It sounds like business get a lot of value out of, checking you out online and also, working with you. So we really appreciate having you on and wish you the best for everything.
Thanks, Simon. Appreciate it. Great to be here.